Hey guys, tonight we're sinking quite literally into one of history's most overworked bedtime stories. You know the one, a city so grand, so spectacular, that it annoyed the gods and got itself dramatically yeeted into the sea. Yeah, Atlantis. So grab your blanket, dim the lights, and let's drift somewhere between history, myth, and everyone's favorite ancient disaster movie except, of course, this one probably didn't happen. Probably. But that won't stop us from floating through what would have happened if it had. Now, let's set the scene. It's around 360 BC. An old Greek guy named Plato is sitting around doing what philosophers do best. Making grand statements and leaving future historians utterly confused. Plato writes about Atlantis in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. His characters mention this ancient, glorious civilization that supposedly existed thousands of years before their time. It had magnificent architecture, a perfect society, and moral perfection so flawless it would make a monk roll his eyes. And then poof, it drowned, wiped out in a day and a night of, quote, misfortune. So, of course, humanity has spent the next 2,000 years trying to find a city that likely came straight from a philosopher's creative writing experiment. But let's float with the fantasy tonight. What if Atlantis was real? What kind of world are we imagining, sinking into the opaque blue? So, first let's talk geography, because Plato was annoyingly vague about it. It was beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which is the ancient Greek way of saying out past Gibraltar. Basically, somewhere past Spain, maybe near the Atlantic. Hence the name Atlantis, the island of Atlas. He describes it as a massive island, larger than Libya and Asia combined. And yes, that sounds immediately suspicious. That's like someone saying, "Oh yeah, I used to live in a small neighborhood," and then describing all of Africa. So maybe Plato wasn't shooting for realism here. But if we suspend disbelief for a minute, what if this giant island actually existed? Imagine a landmass somewhere in the mid-Latatica paradise of temples, gold-plated walls, and extremely smug citizens who thought they'd perfected civilization itself. The Atlanteans, Plato says, were descendants of Poseidon himself, because of course they were. Every great empire needs an angry ocean god for PR. Poseidon, legend says, fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito, because Greek gods had exactly two hobbies: ruling nature and flirting with mortals. Together, they produced an entire dynasty of half-god rulers and sons, each ruling a part of the island. The eldest, Atlas, inherited it all, which is convenient, because that's how we get the name. From there, Atlantis becomes a utopia so textbook it could have been printed on marble. They had advanced architecture, waterworks, massive canals, and silver-coated temples. The main temple, covered in bronze, with a golden statue of Poseidon driving winged horse Usbi Cassideldi, was clearly not their strong suit. For a civilization supposedly thousands of years old, Atlantis sounds suspiciously like a 5th century Greek's idealized dream city with extra glitter. The Atlanteans were brave, noble, and incredibly organized. At least until they weren't. Because that's how every golden age goes. Right? So let's imagine their daily life for a second. Picture marble courtyards filled with chatter, priests pouring perfumed oils before gleaming altars, and scholars sketching the geometry of perfection while pretending not to notice the rising arrogance around them. The air hums with that smug energy civilizations always get before they collapse. Atlantis, in Plato's account, starts declining when divine blood becomes diluted by mortality, which is ancient Greek for everyone started marrying the wrong people. Their moral compass ticks slightly south, greed takes over, and Poseidon's descendants start acting less like gods and more like spoiled aristocrats. At this point, Zeus resident CEO of Divine Punishment looks down, says Timaeus, and basically says, "All right, that's it." According to the myth, he gathers the other gods to discuss what to do. The rest is left unwritten in Plato's draft, but legend fills in the blanks: earthquakes, floods, and one very inconvenient day later, Atlantis vanishes into the sea. A perfect city, perfectly erased. Now, is any of this historically true? Almost certainly not, But let's not think too hard. Let's drift instead into what the world might have looked like if Atlantis had really existed. Suppose, for argument's sake, this was an actual Bronze Age empire, maybe around 1200 BCE, the era of early Greeks, Mycenaeans, Egyptians, and those mysterious sea peoples nobody can quite figure out. This was an age of trade, bronze weapons, and enormous egos. The Atlanteans, then, would fit right in. Picture an island civilization somewhere west of Europe, a maritime power connecting continents, a people whose ships crossed the seas long before anyone else dared. Maybe they traded with Egypt, influenced Crete, and filled the Mediterranean with rumors of a golden empire beyond the horizon. Maybe their technology, aqueducts, irrigation, possibly even something close to writing set the pace for early civilization. In this hypothetical world, Atlantis becomes less fantasy and more like one of those lost chapters of prehistory that we only find in scattered myths. The destruction of the island. Maybe a volcanic eruption, like what happened at Santorini when the Minoan civilization collapsed around 1600 BCE. If you squint a little, the timelines kind of align. That could explain everything, the day and night of misfortune. The floods. The stories passed down orally for centuries until someone like Plato picked them up and rebranded them as philosophy. So maybe Atlantis wasn't an invention. Maybe it was an exaggerated retelling of something older, some real civilization that sank, leaving just enough ruins and just enough myth to fuel to millennia of speculation and very expensive documentaries. But you know what's funny? Every single generation since Plato has been absolutely certain they were the ones to find it. Everyone wants Atlantis. The Victorians, obsessed 19th century explorers pointed at the Azores, the Caribbean, even Antarctica. The 20th century, scientists, mystics, and at least 7 New Age cults insisted they knew where it was, each with wildly different reasons. Even today, Atlantis manages to appear everywhere, from pop culture to conspiracy forums where people are still debating if Disney knew something we don't. Spoiler, they didn't. But let us calm the waves a bit and settle into one of those favorite human habits, imagining ourselves back into the myth. Let's say it's the final night of Atlantis. The sea is restless. The ground rumbles quietly under marble columns. No one panics, yet they're Atlanteans, after all. Their architects build earthquake-proof temples. Their priests have Poseidon on speed dial. But rumor travels. Fishermen whisper about strange lights under the water. The tides pull stronger each morning, and as dawn breaks, the first cracks appear literally across the marble streets. In that moment, perhaps some young scholar, somewhere near the central palace, is trying to preserve their history writing on clay tablets while the ground heaves. Maybe he records their genealogy, their technology, their laws. Maybe some of those tablets never make it out. And then ... the sea takes it. That image, right there, is what keeps Atlantis alive, not the city, but the loss. The idea that somewhere beneath us lies a civilization's final breath, locked under salt water and myth. And yes, it's a little tragic, but also kind of comforting, because the more we look, the more Atlantis becomes a mirror of every empire that's ever existed, rising proud, falling quietly, remembered mostly through stories. Still, let's rewind a bit. Because if we want to imagine Atlantis as real, we should also ask, what kind of people were these Atlanteans? Really, culturally, if we trust Plato's account, they'd be a curious blend, advanced science and deep spirituality. A society where engineering met religion in a way that somehow worked until arrogance tipped the scale. They were probably obsessed with order, sacred geometry, symmetry, proportion, everything perfectly aligned. Temples, palaces, canals stretched like arteries through the capital. It sounds ideal, right? But perfection has an expiry date. Every time a civilization starts describing itself as the perfect one, it's usually 2 dinner parties away from total collapse. Maybe the Atlanteans overextended, building impossible monuments that drained their resources. Or maybe their leaders descended into god-complex territory, convinced divinity ran in their veins. Either way, it's the same ancient rhythm: the higher the glory, the deeper the fall. Let's imagine a typical Atlantean noble. Rich silk robes, sea-themed jewelry, maybe an absurd coral crown. They'd walk through vast halls with echoing marble floors, murals of Poseidon's victories gleaming under bronze torchlight. Their evenings, probably filled with philosophic debates over imported wine and entirely too much self-confidence. Meanwhile, their engineers, the real, unsung heroes, were maintaining the massive canal systems that kept the city alive. Fresh water flowed in from mountains through an ingenious network of channels, while sea gates controlled the tides surrounding their capital. Atlantis, in effect, was one part city, one part machine. If you've ever looked at the ruins of ancient Crete, the Minoan palaces at Knossos might picture something similar. Multi-story buildings, frescoed walls, storage rooms filled with spices and olive oil. It wouldn't be impossible. The Bronze Age knew luxury. But then comes the uncomfortable pattern. Wealth grows, humility vanishes. Nature rolls its eyes. The end rights itself. And according to every ancient myth ever told, hubris never ends quietly. If Atlantis taught us anything, it's that no matter how perfect your plumbing system, you can't outsmart geology. So maybe, just maybe, during those rumbling final moments, as the city began to sink, someone looked up and thought, well, that escalated quickly. All right, let's slowly drift back to the surface, because if we keep sinking here, we'll be joining them. Next, we'll look at what happened after Atlantis. How its echo shaped the imagination of everyone from Plato's students to modern treasure hunters. Let's float forward in time to the philosophers, priests, and explorers who all swore they found it. Spoiler, they didn't. But they really, really tried. Let's pick up where we left. Off Atlantis has sunk, waters closed over it, and all that's left is silence. Or it would have been, if humanity were capable of letting anything go. Spoiler, we are not. See, once Plato wrote about Atlantis, it spread like wildfire through the ancient world. His students and readers all took sides, half convinced it was a philosophical allegory, and the other half ready to sail off with a rock and a dream. Because that's human nature. Give us one mysterious island story, and we'll ruin entire maps chasing it. Even in antiquity, there were debates. Aristotle, Plato's own student, famously muttered something like, "Yeah, Plato made that up to teach a moral lesson." And he was probably right. But then again, Aristotle wasn't exactly the bedtime story type. Meanwhile, other thinkers like Crantor, another of Plato's school buddies, swore Atlantis was real. Crantor even claimed that Egyptian priests he met had old inscriptions that backed up the story. So apparently, Plato's myth had footnotes now. The Egyptian connection mattered because Plato said Solon, the Greek lawgiver, had learned the tale from priests in Sais, Egypt. According to them, Atlantis was an empire that tried and failed to invade Athens. The story had a moral. Athens, humble and virtuous, beat the mighty Atlanteans, who'd grown corrupt. Pretty convenient, really. But Crantor's little yes. It's totally real. I saw the hieroglyphs moment inspired an entire cross-Mediterranean treasure hunt that still hasn't stopped. Jump forward about 1,600 years, Europe's in the middle of the age of exploration, because nothing motivates sailors like possibly finding golden ruins under the sea. Atlantis became the ultimate what-if. Target part historical mystery, part marketing campaign for every empire that wanted to claim ancient glory. By the 1600s, Spanish explorers were insisting Atlantis was somewhere near the Caribbean. Why? Because they really wanted the New World to come with an ancient backstory. Spanish priest Francisco Lopez de Gomara, SAID, America itself, was Atlantis. Look, flooded land masses, native temples, pyramids, it all checks out, he insisted, probably waving a map upside down. And he'd stook for centuries. That theory hung around. After all, the Americas were massive, filled with forgotten ruins Europeans didn't understand. And you can never underestimate the human love for adding myth to geography. The Atlantis equals America idea became a recurring motif right up to the 1800s. Speaking of which, entered the Victorians, absolute champions of overconfident archaeology. The Victorians had maps, cigars, and an endless appetite for self-congratulatory theories. Atlantis, to them, was irresistible. Old, mysterious, and perfect for long gentlemanly debates over port wine. And oh, did they debate? Some said Atlantis was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Naturally, the most dramatic spot possible. Others decided it had to be near the Azores Islands, because Azores sounds vaguely like Atlas. That was about the level of scholarship. Then there were those who looked at every seamound or underwater rock formation and went, "Aha! Temple ruins." One of the most famous of these Victorian Atlanteans was Ignatius Donnelly, a man who, in 1882, published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. It was a bestseller because the 19th century absolutely loved a good speculative catastrophe. Donnelly's theory was simple. Atlantis was the original civilization from which all others descended. Egyptians? Atlantean immigrants. Mayans? You guessed it, Atlanteans. He basically turned Atlantis into history's missing mother culture, the origin of everything, including architecture, astronomy, and good taste. If that sounds a bit far-fetched, that's because it was. Donnelly's sources were mostly ... poetic license, but, he wrote persuasively, with lovely flourishes like Atlantis is the link between Eden and human progress. People adored it, because who doesn't want a single dazzling source of all civilization? For a while, this big ancient lost civilization idea became wildly popular. It blended just the right amount of nostalgia and pseudoscience, sort of like a historical comfort blanket. Then theosophists picked it up, and things got interesting. Mother Melina Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, transformed Atlantis from a historical hypothesis into a spiritual fantasy. In her writings, the Atlanteans weren't just people, they were an advanced psychic race. They updated Plato's metaphor into mysticism, complete wheat-root races, lost wisdom, crystal technologies, and civilizations guided by cosmic beings. By the early 1900s, Atlantis was no longer a city, it was a beef. Fast forward a bit more, and you'll find that Atlantis, the myth, had gone absolutely viral in modern pop culture. It appeared in books, lectures, seances, and of course, tabloid stories. Everyone was suddenly clairvoyantly remembering their Atlantean past lives. In 1939, a psychic named Edgar Cayce, nicknamed the Sleeping Prophet, confidently predicted that Atlantis would rise again in the 1960s, conveniently near the Bahamas. Spoiler: it did not. What did rise around that time, though, was scuba diving, and ... Well, that's close enough. But we have to pause. Here the Cayce chapter alone is peak Atlantis energy. Cayce didn't just predict the island would reappear, he built an entire spiritual cosmology around it. In his trances, he described Atlanteans as a super-scientific people who used crystal power to harness energy. Unfortunately, their experiments, according to Cayce, went wrong and destroyed their island. Moral lesson: don't overuse clean energy. I guess he also said Atlantean souls reincarnated into modern humans. It was a surprisingly effective form of flattery. Could tell someone, you're a reincarnated Atlantean engineer, and they'd immediately buy your crystal necklace. It was exactly the sort of mystical optimism the mid-20th century thrived on, half self-help, half archaeology, and all vibes. Now, the 1960s came and went. Atlantis did not rise, but the theory found a new home in pop culture. Sci-fi writers loved the idea. So did pseudo-historians. Atlantis got its own tropes: glowing ruins, ancient AI, underwater kingdoms guarded by mermaids. And honestly, by this point, the search for the real Atlantis had stopped being archaeology at all. It had become a story about human longing for perfection, for lost wisdom, for that dream that maybe we were once better than we are now. Still, plenty of people in actual science have tried to look seriously. One of the most rational candidates ever considered is Santorini, the Greek island that exploded in a gigantic volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE. Its Minoan civilization vanished overnight, leaving behind eerily beautiful ruins at Akrotiri frescoes, pottery, homes perfectly preserved in ash. to an imaginative Greek living centuries later. Maybe that story survived as an island punished by the gods. Replace volcano with Poseidon's wrath and, well, you've got your Atlantis origin. Others have suggested more down-to-earth candidates. Spain's Donana wetlands, which satellite images show were once a potential coastal city. Or even Doggerland, the submerged land between Britain and Europe that drowned long ago. But the truth is, the myth is bigger than any map. It always has been. Every Atlantis found headline is secretly saying the same thing: we want to believe greatness was once ours and could be again. We keep rewriting the myth because it's less about a place and more about nostalgia itself. The story works because it feels like memory-ancient, half-forgotten, dazzling, tragic. Still, the attempts are entertaining. You've got German cartographers in the 1920s claiming it was near the Canary Islands, Soviet geologists in the 1950s testing sonar in the Atlantic, and a rotating cast of TV documentarians convinced every grain of sand hides a palace. My favorite might be the Bimini Road. Discovered in the Bahamas in 1968, this underwater rock formation looks suspiciously man-made rows of limestone blocks curving like a road. Case believers immediately said, "See, proof, Atlantis." Scientists, on the other hand, said, "That's just natural beach rock." And as usual, no one changed their mind. But that's exactly how Atlantis survives, forever existing in that hazy middle ground between geology and myth, science and wishful thinking. Let's zoom out for a second. Picture the globe as explorers and dreamers have imagined it every ocean floor like an unopened history book. Down there, under miles of pressure and silence, we project our collective dreams. Maybe it's human arrogance, or maybe it's hope, but either way, Atlantis refuses to sink completely, because even if it never existed physically, it does exist mentally. Every time we chase impossible perfection, every time we say we used to be better, we're channeling the same myth Plato began. The past as paradise, the future as recovery. It's poetic and a little sad, like rereading your own diary knowing how it ends. All right, before we nod off completely, we'll drift one more time in the next part into how Atlantis transformed into metaphor, a reflection of progress, decline, and that oddly comforting human urge to believe everything lost can someday be found. So now that every explorer, mystic, and medium has claimed ownership of Atlantis, what's left? Well, what is left is the one thing Plato probably meant it to be all along. An allegory, a moving, slightly moralistic bedtime story about how even the best civilizations tend to collapse once they start believing their own press releases. In fact, if you strip away all the gold statues and sea gods, Plato's original purpose is almost disappointingly practical. Atlantis was never meant to be a travel brochure. It was a warning wrapped in marble columns and mythic scale. In Critias, his unfinished dialogue, he lays it out rather neatly. Athens was the noble city that kept moral virtue. Atlantis, on the other hand, lost its divine spark and drowned itself in arrogance. Basically, the entire myth is one long "don't let power make you stupid" parable. But, of course, humanity took that moral fable and turned it into the world's longest treasure hunt, because nothing says missing the point like spending thousands of years looking for a metaphor with a submarine. Still, even as the literal search got wilder, the idea of Atlantis as symbol started to thrive. And not just in philosophy, it soaked straight into art, politics, and ideology, which, as we know, is always a dangerous combination. Let's drift through that for a bit. During the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered Plato, Atlantis gained new life among thinkers and dreamers. The 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries were brimming with optimism, new lands discovered, new maps drawn, and endless confidence that human reason could explain everything. Atlantis suddenly became the Renaissance's favorite daydream. Philosophers and visionaries started writing their own new Atlantis versions, utopias, built on reason, science, and very questionable social hierarchies. The most famous is Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, written in 1626. Bacon imagined an island civilization devoted to knowledge and experimentation. Basically, Plato's Atlantis, but with lab coats. It had research institutes, moral order, and kindly patriarchal scientists running everything sort of like Hogwarts, if you replaced spells with proto-scientific method and added a bit more smugness. Bacon's story wasn't subtle. His Atlantis-like island, called Bens, was clearly meant as an intellectual fantasy what society could look like under rational rule. It's tidy, moral, and suspiciously just the way every philosopher likes it in theory, and no one likes it in practice. Since then, every era has used Atlantis to reflect whatever it wants to believe or fear about itself. In the Enlightenment, it became a symbol of rational progress. In Romanticism, it was the tragic lost world, full of beauty and longing. In the Industrial Age, it was nostalgia for a simpler past that definitely never existed. And then, inevitably, governments got involved. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a few European writers twisted the myth of Atlantis into racial theory. It was the homeland of a superior ancient race that spread civilization. That, unfortunately, was how a harmless bedtime parable morphed into a very non-harmless ideological tool. But even this dark detour tells you something about Atlantis. It's flexible. It absorbs whatever meaning people project onto it. Philosopher, it becomes a moral story. Mystic, it becomes a cosmic lineage. Politician, it becomes convenient propaganda. Atlantis is less like a place and more like a cultural mirror that reflects whatever the world is thinking at the time. Now, move into the modern era. Atlantis goes full Hollywood. By the 20th century, the myth had become pop culture shorthand for any lost, mysterious, or advanced world. You could drop the name Atlantis into any movie, comic book, or novel, and the audience would instantly get it. The word itself became ambient storytelling. You know it's lost. It's grand. It's romantic. And it's probably doomed. We've had every imaginable version of Atlantis by now. The underwater city with glass domes, the ancient alien outpost, the high-tech energy capital, the undersea utopia with suspiciously fit mermaid residents. It's astonishing how one ancient fable has adapted to every genre like some mythological shape. The 1960s and 70s brought a full revival in this department. While Edgar Case's psychic prophecies faded, comic books and sci-fi picked them up. Suddenly, Atlantis was full of immortal civilizations, tinkering with energy beams and forgetting morality. A comforting throwback, the same old downfall, just now with lasers. And then, of course, came television documentaries the kind, with dramatic orchestral music and blurry underwater footage of rocks. You know the ones. Someone always declares, could this be Atlantis? In the exact tone people use when they already know it isn't. But maybe that's the point. It's not really about proving anything. It's about keeping the mystery alive. Atlantis today has become less about history and more about yearning. We chase it because we like the idea that somewhere, beneath waves or time, there was once a golden age, proof that humans were once wiser, kinder, closer to the gods. We keep retelling it because we need that reassurance that perfection existed, even if only for a moment. And maybe because Atlantis offers an odd comfort. Every civilization that rises also falls. But Atlantis reminds us that even in ruin, beauty endures in memory, in story. In the quiet question we keep asking, what if? So maybe that's what makes it such a soothing story to think about at night. It's paradoxically tragic and gentle at the same time. The ultimate lullaby of history, a civilization too grand to last, softly fading beneath the sea, taking its vanity and its splendor with it. And isn't that every empire's bedtime story? Rome, gone. The Aztecs, gone. Byzantium, gone. The world keeps turning. The waves roll in, and we dream their dreams again. It's a little poetic, a little melancholic, and if Plato could see the millions of books, documentaries, and conspiracy blogs dedicated to his little moral tale, he'd probably blink twice and say, "You realize I made that up, right?" Still, if Atlantis has taught us anything, it's that stories, like cities, don't die. They just sink somewhere quieter, waiting for someone to stumble across them again. All right, Let's let the waves settle for tonight. Maybe it never existed. Maybe it did. Either way, it exists in us, in that part of the human mind that refuses to stop imagining better worlds. Somewhere out there, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the sea still holds space for what we lost, or what we only ever dreamed. So ereviare, gently drifting toward the quieter waters of the story, where Atlantis lingers but not as a place, more as a question. Not something found, but something felt. The sea holds its depths carefully. It doesn't rush to reveal its treasures, not because they're lost forever, but maybe because some things are better left to imagination. Atlantis, then, becomes that whisper beneath the waves, a fading shimmer of marble and bronze, a tale that refuses to settle. It reminds us that perfection is often fragile, time-patient, and memory-selective. And as we float here, between myth and meaning, the story isn't quite ending. It's pausing, waiting for the next curious mind, the next dreamer, the next voice to pick up the thread and carry it forward. Because maybe the real Atlantis is not under the sea at all, but inside USA, in our longing to find something greater, something lost or yet to be made. And with that, we'll leave this chapter open, a gentle current guiding us toward new stories, new mysteries. Stay tuned, because soon we'll dive into another intriguing past, where history folds quietly into legend, and the past whispers just a little louder. For now, let the waves settle. But no, the story like, the ocean never truly sleeps. Now we begin with a mystery that has been giving historians mild headaches and endless speculation for over 4 centuries. It is the story of the Roanoke Colonitha English settlement in the late 16th century that basically pulled an ultimate vanishing act. No dramatic battles, no creepy horror tales, just a whole colony that simply disappeared. So, settle in, dim the lights, get comfy, and prepare to drift through a story that's more puzzled eyebrow than pulse-pounding thriller. Let's float back to the 1580s, when England was really excited about the idea of making new colonies across the Atlantic. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, had just risen to power and thought, why not throw some English people onto some nice American land and just see what happens? Because of course she did. That's basically how empires started back then, lots of hope and a fair bit of poor planning. The first settlers landed on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what's now North Carolina. In 1585, it was supposed to be the first permanent English colony in the New World. The troubles started almost immediately. Food was scarce. Relations with local native tribes were a roller coaster of friendly meetings and tense confrontations. And the colonists had no idea how to build a sustainable life from what was essentially wilderness. After a rough winter and dwindling supplies, the colony's leader, Ralph Lane, decided to head back to England for more help and supplies. In the meantime, the settlers were left to fend for themselves, or so it seemed. Enter John White, an artist and the colony's new governor. War returned in 1587, with some new colonists, including women and children. This was supposed to be the fresh start everyone was hoping for. Families, hope, the beginnings of a real society, not just a poorly supplied outpost. White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare, was born, the first English child born in the Americas. A detail history remembers, but which didn't seem to bring the luck everyone so desperately wanted. Now, if this were a straightforward history class, we'd end here. Settlers arrive. They build a colony. They prosper. The rest is history. But ite e not, because White returned to England shortly after, with the grim job of getting more supply due to a series of unfortunate events, and a little bit of war with Spain. He couldn't get back for 3 years. When White finally returned in 1590, Roanoke was deserted. There were no bodies, no battle scars, no obvious signs of struggle, just an eerily empty settlement. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan, carved into a post, and crow etched into a nearby tree. What does that mean? It's the island south of Roanoke, home to the friendly Croatoan tribe. It was likely a message, some attempt to tell White where the settlers had gone, but no definitive explanation ever came. Historians have floated plenty of theories. Maybe the settlers moved to Croatoan Island and integrated with the natives. Maybe they were wiped out by hostile tribes or disease. Maybe they starved, or tried to sail back to England on their own risky plan that didn't end well. No solid evidence ever came to light, and the mystery deepened. The Roanoke colony was dubbed the Lost Colony, and became an early American legend, a cautionary tale of colonial hubris and the unforgiving wilderness. What's fascinating is how this all went down without any dramatic conflicts, conspiracies, or large-scale battles worthy of epic poetry. Just quiet, patient disappearance that leaves more questions than answers. And, like any good historical puzzle, it's the little oddities that gather the most attention. The lone clue, Croatoan, is like a whisper in the wind holding a secret no one quite cracked. So imagine this group of English colonists quietly walking away, folding into a new life with indigenous people, or simply vanishing into the woods, leaving behind their huts and dreams silent ghosts of ambition and desperation. But before we drift further into speculation, let us meet a few key players, because every lost colony has its characters causing all sorts of unintended drama. First, Sir Walter Raleigh, of the official visionary and promoter of Roanoke. He didn't set foot there himself, but was the man behind the plan. His vision was grand, promising gold, new trade routes, and endless glory for England. Of course, none of that happened as planned. Because why not double down on impossible dreams? Raleigh was ambitious, persistent, and utterly unbothered by catastrophic logistical failures. You have to admire that. Then there's John White, the artist governor who risked everything for a fresh start, only to return and find nothing but silence. He represents not just hope, but the gut-wrenching heartbreak of losing everything you've worked for with no clue why. And, of course, the indigenous tribes, the Croatoan and the Sakatan, who interacted with the settlers in complicated ways that could be described as a mix of cautious hospitality and rightful suspicion. They hold part of the silent answer. But they didn't write the history books that followed. As we drift through this story, keep in mind, there was no dramatic end to Roanoke. It's not a tale of fiery conquest or heroic survival. It's the quiet fading of a dream, echoed by a single word carved deep into wood. All right, let's float over to some of the theories and stories spun around this mystery. Because, of course, humans don't like loose ends, and Roanoke might just be the biggest loose end of them all. All right, so the Roanoke colony vanished without a trace, leaving behind just one cryptic word, Croatoan. Kind of like someone leaving a post-it note that says, "Gone fishing," except a lot less helpful. Historians have floated a handful of ideas about what happened. The first big theory: the colonists moved to Croatoan Island and joined the native tribe there. It makes practical sense. They were running low on supplies, isolated, and facing a tough environment. If the locals were friendly enough, why not blend in and try to survive? Some anthropologists and archaeologists have suggested that descendants of the Roanoke settlers might have lived on, merging with indigenous communities. There are even tantalizing reports from later Native American tribes of light-skinned people living among them, sparking all kinds of speculation. Since written records are basically non-existent, this remains a mystery wrapped in oral traditions. Another, less cozy theory is that the settlers met a grisly end to disease, starvation, or violence. It was the 16th century. After all, the New World was full of unfamiliar diseases, harsh winters, and often tense relations with native groups uneasy about colonial. If the colony couldn't secure steady supplies or defend itself, they might have simply died out in the wilderness. For a while, some even wondered if the Spanish, who were rivals to the English at the time, had destroyed the settlement. Spain controlled much of the Caribbean and parts of the southeastern coast. However, there's no strong evidence to pin the blame on Spanish attacks, and such an event would likely have left some signs. Then there's the possibility the colonists tried to sail back to England on their own. Picture a group of exhausted, desperate settlers building boats to make a perilous transatlantic voyage in the 16th century. Yikes. The odds were not great. No records suggest they succeeded, and lost at sea is a plausible fate. And let's not forget all the wild theories tossed around in more recent times: secret underground cities, alien abductions, government, you name it. Some late-night internet forum has suggested it. None have much serious evidence backing them up. But hey, mysteries do tend to bring out the creativity. Whatever really happened, Roanoke remains a quiet, lingering question mark in history. It wasn't a violent crash, it was a slow fade. A failed experiment in colonization that slipped quietly into the woods and waves, leaving behind an empty settlement and a carved word that haunts the imagination. So, next time you think about lost civilizations, remember that some disappearances are just about survival, desperation, and the hard reality of starting anew in a strange land. No monsters, no conspiracies, just people, caught in a moment of history that kept its secrets. All right. Let us float gently onward to some of the keys and clues that researchers have hunted for centuries in hopes of shedding light on this quiet vanish. All right, now let us float over to some of the clues and evidence that historians and archaeologists have been teasing apart for years, hoping to solve Roanoke's quiet disappearance. First, there's the mysterious carved word Croatoan left at the empty settlement. As we mentioned, it most likely pointed to Croatoan Island, now known as Hatteras Island. John White, the colony's governor, had instructed that if the settlers moved, they should carve the name of their new location. No distress signal or cross marks, which some interpret as a sign they left voluntarily or at least without immediate danger. Archaeologists have since explored Croatoan Island and nearby areas in search of artifacts that would suggest English settlers lived among the local tribes. Some artifacts, like English-style tools, pottery shards, and carved objects, have been found mixed with native artifacts, hinting at some level of integration or interaction. But nothing conclusively proves the entire colony resettled there. Several Native American tribes in the region later told of light-skinned people living among them, though it's unclear if these were descendants of Roanoke settlers, intermarried families, or something else. Oral traditions can be beautifully cryptic, leaving us with tantalizing possibilities and no definitive answers. One particularly intriguing find was the discovery of a few European-style armor pieces and other colonial-era objects hundreds of miles inland, in places like Virginia and North Carolina, suggesting some colonists may have dispersed over time, perhaps fleeing conflict or searching for better conditions. There have also been archaeological digs on Roanoke Island, itself uncovering remains of houses, tools, and food storage that hint at the colony's way of life, but don't reveal much about their fate after they vanished. It is like trying to read the last chapter of a book from torn pages scattered and lost. Of course, part of the mystery is the passage of time or erosion, changes in landscape, and the destruction wrought by nature and humans alike. Coastal islands shift, rivers change course, and over hundreds of years, the faintest traces of a small colony can disappear under layers of sand and soil. The search for Roanoke isn't just digging up dirt. It's piecing together a fragile story from centuries-old whispers, weathered wood, and faded memories. Despite modern technology, ground-penetrating radar, underwater exploration Roanoke refuses to reveal its final secret. It remains an invitation to wonder, perfect for quiet reflection or a sleep-inducing session of unpredictable history. So, while we don't have a clear answer, the story gently reminds us that sometimes history's softest mysteries are the ones that linger long, an echo rather than a shout, waiting patiently beneath the surface for someone to listen. Next, we can glide into the broader significance of Roanoke's disappearance, how it shaped the American colonial mindset, and why it still captures imaginations today. So now, as we start to wrap this particular quiet chapter about Roanoke, it's worth thinking about what this story tells us beyond the mystery itself. Roanoke wasn't just an early failed colony. It's a symbol of human hope and the harsh realities of trying to start a new life in an unknown land. It shows us how sometimes, even with the best intentions and efforts, things slip quietly out of control, leaving behind more questions than answers. Its disappearance left a shadow on English colonial ambitions. A cautionary whisper that maybe conquering new worlds was not as simple as planting a flag and declaring victory. It reminds us that history isn't always shaped by clashes or grand victories, but sometimes by slow fades into the unknown. And that's a kind of story all its own, soft, unanswered, and infinitely patient. So for now, let's leave Roanoke in that gentle silence, a quiet echo of dreams, half-lived, and secrets half-kept beneath the forests and tides. There will be more stories soon, but this one ends, here for tonight. At least, weary stepping softly into the marble halls of one of history's most glamorous overachievers, Alexander the Great. You know the drill. Dim the lights, find a comfortable spot, maybe grab a blanket or your favorite sleepy beverage, because we're about to drift back to 323 BC, to the hot, slightly smelly heart of ancient Babylon. And no worries, this isn't the epic conquest kind of Alexander story. No shouting, no horse noises, no swords clashing. We're not here for battles or glory. We're here for something far more hypnotic. How one of history's most legendary men quietly fell apart. Because, weirdly enough, after conquering most of the known world before he even hit 33, Alexander's story ends not with a fever, and then a long, tense silence in a royal bedroom. But, of course, nothing involving Alexander was ever simple. The man loved drama, and apparently, even his death had to inspire a few centuries of wild conspiracy theories. So, let's settle in. Close your eyes if you'd like, because tonight we're floating through the final days of a man who thought he was a god and maybe, just maybe, found out he wasn't. It all begins in early June, 323 BC Babylon. That's modern-day era. If you're wondering, was dusty, loud, and crowded with soldiers. Alexander had just done something that, depending on who you ask, was either genius-level ambition or just cosmic-level ego. He'd built an empire that stretched from Greece all the way to India, and now he was back from his last campaign, basking in his own myth. Picture this: gold everywhere, perfume and incense hanging in the air so thick you could taste it. Dozens of courtiers hovering around a man barely 32 years old, whose favorite pastime other than conquering civilizations was pretending to be a literal demigod. And honestly, people went along with it, because at that point, who was going to tell him no? But beneath all the divine swagger, something was off. Alexander wasn't the glowing marble statue his fanboys liked to paint. The man was exhausted. He'd marched thousands of miles through deserts, jungles, and frostbitten mountains, slept in tents for a decade, and drank enough wine to float a trireme. His body was starting to mutiny. Still, he tried to act like nothing was wrong. There were weddings to plan, mostly political, of course, because the royal family that conquers together stays together. There were endless feasts, and there was that casual godhood thing to maintain. Then came the night that started it all. It was early June in Babylon. The temperature was floating somewhere near don't even try to move. Alexander attended a banquet at the house of a nobleman named who must have been one of those guys who thought let us host a dinner party for a stressed-out conqueror was a good idea. Historically speaking, that night ends badly. The sources disagree on what happened. Some say Alexander drank a massive bowl of unmixed wine, which, in ancient Greek terms, is like saying he just chugged a gallon of pure ethanol for fun. Others suggest maybe the wine was spiked with poison. Some say he laughed through the night, felt fine at first, and then started burning up with fever. Whatever it was, the next day, Alexander woke up shivering. And here's where history starts to sound like the world's slowest medical mystery. For about 11 days, the most powerful man on Earth drifted in and out of consciousness. His fever climbed. His speech slurred. He lost the ability to move, and yet his mind, Aragon's side, seemed weirdly clear. They brought him water and fruit. They fanned him. His officers stood by, waiting for orders he couldn't give. He didn't die quickly. He lingered, and then simply stopped breathing. That should have been the end of it, right? Not even close. Because when his body didn't start decomposing for days, people lost it. The rumor practically wrote itself. He wasn't really dead. Now, before we get into all the theories Oh, there are plenty. Let's float back for a second and talk about who Alexander really was at this point in his life, because it helps to understand why everyone thought this could have been, well, divina intervention. Alexander Wathan, Tejastaking. He was this weird fusion of warlord, philosopher, an intense theater kid who desperately wanted to live forever. He believed he was descended from Achilles, the ancient Greek hero who also wasn't exactly quiet about his god complex. Alexander even carried around a copy of the Iliad annotated by Aristotle, because of course he'd and modeled himself after its tragic hero. The only problem, Achilles was famously doomed to die young, which, if you're into irony, aged terribly well. Anyway, by 323 BC, Alexander had already done what no one thought was possible. He'd crushed the Persian Empire, stormed across Asia, and tried unsuccessfully to reach the ends of the earth. His men were done. They wanted to go home. But Alexander, wanteth more. Exploration, legacy, maybe immortality. So, when the invincible king suddenly fell ill, people didn't just shrug. They panicked, because it either meant the gods were angry or someone somewhere had dared to mix poison in the wine of a man who claimed to be half divine. The poisoning theory became the ancient world's favorite rumor mill topic. According to one camp, it was the general and he'd been left in charge of Macedon while Alexander was off doing his global tours of domination, and apparently he didn't love the micromanagement. Alexander had been making noises about replacing him, so, the theory goes, Antipater might be bribed Medea, that dinner host, to slip something deadly into the cup. Was there evidence? Not really. But when has that ever stopped a royal scandal from sounding convincing? Then there were whispers about Aristotle being involved. Yes, that Aristotle, Alexander's old tutor. Apparently, he didn't take too kindly to being ignored by his famous former student. Would the father of Western philosophy really stoop to hired assassination? Probably not, but it's the kind of gossip ancient courtiers love to whisper behind fig leaves. Of course, actual historians have their own theories. Some think Alexander died of typhoid fever. Others suggest malaria, West Nile virus, or a mix of heat exhaustion and old war wounds. Then there's the exception-based favorite, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which could explain the paralysis and the intact body. But the poison story? That's the one that stuck around, because, let's be honest, it's just so royal. Days after his death, Babylon turned into an emotional swamp. There were soldiers crying in corridors, generals staring at the floor, and somewhere in the middle of it all, the question everyone avoided asking, now what? Alexander had no official heir. His wife Roxanias, the Bactrian princess he'd married after conquering her homeland, was pregnant, but the baby wasn't born yet, and the rest of Alexander's family tree was complicated, to say the least. His half-brother Aridius was technically alive, but his mental health made him unfit to rule. So, the empire that one man built in a decade instantly began to wobble. The generals known later as the Diadocio successors started strategizing within hours of the body cooling. They tried to present a united front, but honestly, no one bought it. Babylon became a pressure cooker of whispered coups and planned betrayals. Meanwhile, the embalmers were getting nervous. The king's body hadn't that was either a miracle or, depending who you asked, a problem. After a week, it still looked eerily lifelike. The priests began calling it a divine sign. But the soldiers called it something else, proof that Alexander was never just human. Which, if you think about it, is peak irony. A man who spent his whole life performing godhood accidentally convinced everyone only after dying. Now, before things slide too deep into mythology, let's pause and picture the scene. The royal palace at Babylon was like a luxurious hospital and war camp mashed together. There were the smoky lamps burning slow oil, the constant murmur of slaves and attendants, and that restless heat pressing down from the Mesopotamian sun. Outside the palace, tens of thousands of soldiers waited, uneasily. They'd heard rumors. They'd been told their king was only ill. Some said he'd recover any moment. But then his friends began carrying his body to the temple for ritual mourning, And reality hit. One eyewitness, supposedly one of the soldiers, said the entire army shuffled past his bed in silence. One by one, each man raised his hand or head to salute their motionless king. And Alexander Silent, maybe already gone, reportedly opened his eyes and moved his fingers. Creepy. Definitely symbolic. Also, yes, if the story's even half true, it might have been the last flicker of life, or just nerves settling. Ancient biographers, of course, treated it as the stuff of miracles. But it added one last eerie note to a career already drenched in legend. When doctors finally declared him dead, no one agreed on what to do with the body. Greeks believed burial should happen quickly. Egyptians thought a royal corpse was practically sacred. So naturagi, the compromise was, steal it. A few years later, while his embalmed remains were being transported to Macedonia, one of his generals, Ptolemy, hijacked the funeral caravan and rerouted it to Egypt. Because if you're going to set yourself up as a pharaoh, what's better than owning the world's most famous body? The body was displayed in Alexandria 4 centuries first in a golden sarcophagus, then a glass one. Julius Caesar even stopped by to pay his respects, because apparently visiting Alexander's corpse was like the ancient world's version of meeting a celebrity. Then, as history always does, the location faded away. By the 4th century AD, the tomb's exact spot was already lost to legend. Alexandria grew, burned, flooded, rebuilt, and the resting place of the great conqueror quietly vanished beneath its streets. Fitting, really. The man who wanted immortality got it, just not in the way he expected. By now, you might be thinking, surely historians have figured this out, right? Surely someone, somewhere, knows exactly what killed him. Not quite, because the more you read, the clearer it becomes that Alexander's death wasn't a single tidy event. It was less political ambition, exhaustion, tropical disease, maybe a dash of vindictive karma. He spent his whole life chasing eternity, and when it came, it was painfully slow. And yet, somehow, the myth outlived the man. Greek poets called him the god who died. Medieval kings tried to claim descent from him. Even now, there are conspiracy theories about secret burial chambers under Alexandria, waiting to be rediscovered. Maybe that's how Alexander wanted it, to keep the world curious, to remain, quite literally, the man no one could put in the ground. Let's float there for a bit in that strange twilight between history and imagination. Babylon fading into night, soldiers whispering outside the palace walls, the hum of insects over the river. Somewhere Alexander's empty drinking bowl, still sitting on the table, its contents forever debated. The greatest conqueror of the ancient world, brought down not by an army but by something as simple as a fever. Because in the end, no matter how divine someone claims to be, there's always the human body, fragile, tired, and mortal. But don't worry, his story doesn't end here. No. When Alexander died, he left behind an empire so massive and leaderless that it practically begged for chaos. And chaos, of course, is exactly what came next. Let's drift toward that, slowly, in the next part. So, when we left off, Alexander was goner, at least, mostly gone. His body was lying in Babylon, embalmed and mysteriously refusing to rot. His generals were trying not to stab each other at breakfast. And outside, a few 100,000 soldiers were waiting for anyone to tell them what came next. Nobody really knew who was in charge. But hey, Roxana was pregnant, which was exciting. Like, in 9 months, we might have a little ruler. But monarchies usually prefer their successors alive, visible, and capable of signing orders. So instead of celebration, there was a tense, sweaty silence in the palace courtyards. The moment Alexander's breath had stopped, the empire's unity had gone with it. Let us not dramatize, because we staying calm and sleepy but. This was basically the political version of a sandcastle meeting a wave. The first cracks appeared instantly. Perdiccas, one of Alexander's top commanders, was in charge of the royal bodyguard, which, in old Greek nobility code, meant the person everyone fears, but still tolerates at dinner parties. He was loyal, ambitious, and maybe just sane enough to think he could manage the situation. After a very tense meeting, the generals decided to wait until Roxana gave birth. The unborn child would be the heir. They said unless she gave birth to a girl, in which case they'd rethink the whole plan. To keep things organized in the meantime, they appointed Alexander's half-brother Aridius as a sort of placeholder king. He was physically present and had royal blood, which, in ancient politics, was considered good enough. So, in theory, there were two rulers now: a fragile unborn baby, and a fragile adult with limited mental capacity. If this sounds like a bad idea, you're absolutely correct. As Babylon sweltered under the summer sun, the generals, now calling themselves the successors, started playing a long, exhausting game of political chess. Each one had a personal army, a region of influence, and a very inflated sense of self-importance. There was Ptolemy, who'd clearly been studying leadership by example. His first brilliant move: stealing Alexander's corpse, but that comes a bit later. Then there was Seleucus, quiet but calculating; Antigonus, forever scheming; and of course Perdiccas, who still thought he could keep the empire whole. Spoiler: he could not. Managing Alexander's conquests was like trying to herd sandstorms. You had Greece, full of rebellious city-states that technically adored Alexander only after he conquered them. You had Persia, with nobles quietly plotting a comeback. You had Egypt, which adored the dead king, but also adored whoever fed them grain. And over it all, that huge question hovered like a lazy drone: what happens to the dream? Meanwhile, Roxana, now a widow, technically became the center of palace gossip. She was young, foreign, and about to give birth to what everyone hoped would be a political life raft. Her biggest problem: Alexander had left behind other wives, Persian wives. State-sponsored marriages meant to unite East and West, but now they were just royal inconveniences. So Roxana decided to solve that problem in the most direct way possible. She had them eliminated. There's no surviving diary entry of her thoughts, of course, but one imagines she wasn't in the mood for co-parenting arrangements. After all, the son she was about to give birth to wasn't just any baby. He'd be Alexander IV of Macedonia, technically ruler of the known world. At least until someone helped themselves to his throne. The child was born healthy. For about 5 minutes, everyone pretended it meant stability. Then they went right back to plotting each other's downfall. Perdiccas assumed the role of regent. His job was to protect Roxana and the baby, manage the sprawling territories, and keep the generals civil. You can probably guess how that went. His first mistake was arrogance, followed closely by geography. Babylon was inconveniently far from Macedonia, and many soldiers just wanted to return home. Getting them to stay loyal required more charisma than Perdiccas possessed. At one point, his rivals tried to divide the empire into manageable zones, giving governors semi-independent control. That sounded fine on paper. But you know what happens when ambitious men get a taste of autonomy? Let's just say the concept of teamwork aged poorly. Within Ager skirmishes began. Armies mute, regions drifted apart like continents, splitting under tectonic stress. Alexander's dream of a united empire stretching from the Mediterranean to India collapsed faster than his embalming table could cool. And then came the fun part: transporting the royal body. For the ancient world, burial wasn't a detail, it was everything. Where a man's body rested, said Hun, controlled his legacy. So when the funeral procession began, carrying Alexander's gold-coated coffin on a massive carriage, said to glitter brighter than sunlight, it wasn't just a ceremony. It was a contest. Officially, the plan was to bring the king home to Macedonia, where his family tomb waited. But then Ptolemy, who'd already started setting himself up as Egypt's ruler, had a more creative idea. He intercepted the procession somewhere near Syria, calmly, strategically, and with just enough muscle to make negotiation unnecessary. He rerouted the body to Egypt. Did this cause outrage? Naturally, but outrage rarely stopped Ptolemy. He installed the body in Memphis first, and later in a brand new capital, Alexandria. And just like that, he turned possession of a corpse into political legitimacy. Thousands flocked to see it. The cult that formed around Alexander's tomb became half shrine, half propaganda center. If you ever think celebrity culture is a modern thing, remember this: Alexander's mummified body was still getting visitors 300 years later. Cleopatra herself visited, which is kind of poetic Egypt-esque. Last great queen gazing down at the man who set the stage for her own dynasty-esque story. Back in what remained of the empire, Perdiccas made his fatal misstep. He tried to invade Egypt too, reclaim Alexander's body, and impress his troops. But his army wasn't feeling inspired, and during a disastrous river crossing, soldiers drowned by the hundreds. His officers, deciding this was perhaps a sign from the gods that they needed new management, assassinated him in his tent. That was the end of the so-called unity. After that, warfare between the successors became basically an annual tradition. Every time one general died, another picked up the crown-shaped baton and kept the chaos spinning. If this feels repetitive, imagine living through it. B320 BC, the once mighty empire had splintered into neat, lonely fragments. Ptolemy, Hadija. Seleucus carved out most of the Near East. Antigonus ruled parts of Anatolia. Cassander grabbed Macedon and Greece. The great dream of a multicultural, blended world that Alexander had imagined when he married all those inconvenient queens and founded a bunch of cities named after himself. Dissolved. What remained were little Alexanders, many of them literally named after him, pretending they were the next big thing. It's oddly fitting, in a melancholy way. Alexander spent his life chasing eternity, and in the end, his closest friends guaranteed that eternity would take the shape of total fragmentation. Of course, that didn't stop them from claiming to be his spiritual heirs. They stamped his face on their coins, built statues that looked suspiciously flattering, and kept talking about continuing his legacy, usually while invading each other. Issa territorius. It is the political version of saying "we read totally fine" during an obvious meltdown. As for Roxana and her baby, their story turned quietly tragic. For a few years, Cassander, the new Macedonian power, broke, pretended they were under his protection. Then he had them executed, because apparently respecting royal bloodlines wasn't trending. Alexander's mother, Olympias, tried to protect her grandson, but she was equally ruthless. She'd ruled Macedonia with absolute, fiery paranoia ever since Philip's death. Eventually, she too was killed. By the time the dust settled, almost every direct relative of Alexander was gone. The empire didn't just lose its literate, lost its entire line. And what about the tomb we mentioned? Ptolemy's Egyptian descendants, the Ptolemies. Yes, those ones turned it into a centerpiece of royal cult worship. Over generations, they merged Alexander's image with that of a local god, Serapis, turning him into something between a saint and a marketing symbol. Romans later joined in, paying pilgrimage as if visiting a celebrity relic. Caesar, Augustus, Caligula each made a stop at what they called the tomb of the divine Alexander. But by late antiquity, one of the most visited monuments in the world quietly disappeared. Floods, earthquakes, shifting coastlines, some combination of those swallowed it. Archaeologists still hunt for it today, combing through layers of Alexandria, occasionally declaring victory, then changing their minds months later. If bones could roll their eyes, Alexander's probably would. So perhaps if we whisper this softly enough, it is worth asking what the great conqueror would have thought of all this. His dream was vast but vague. He wanted unity, but ruled by charisma and exhaustion. He aimed for godhood, but ended up falling to something as simple as an infection. Ironically, he found a kind of immortality, just not in the straightforward way he imagined. His death reshaped the world more than his conquests did. The fragments of his empire evolved into powerful kingdoms that spread Greek language, art, and culture across Asia and Egypt. The Hellenistic Age, historians call it. It's easy to forget that when you hear the word collapse. Sometimes collapse is just transformation with bad PR. Imagine it now, centuries later, the lamps of Babylon long since turned to dust, Alexandria glowing faintly under the modern city, and somewhere beneath layers of stone and sand, that missing tomb waiting like an unsolved riddle. The conqueror who tried to bridge continents still lies between them, suspended in history's sleepy half-light. Maybe that's just how Alexander wanted it here, but not really gone. So, Alexander's gone. The empire is gone, and everyone's favorite embalmed celebrity is lying somewhere under a modern city nobody can quite excavate. But his story, of course, stayed annoyingly alive, because the ancient world just couldn't let go. The man had crossed continents like it was a hiking hobby. He wasn't supposed to die from something as boring as a fever. That would be like Zeus slipping on olive oil and breaking his neck. So, soon after his death, the theories started multiplying like overexcited historians at a symposium. The first batch of gossip came straight from those who had been there. Soldiers and servants wrote, "Letazor, what passed for letter stalking?" about mysterious symptoms, fevers that rose and fell, stabbing pains, a loss of voice, paralysis that crept up gradually. Some even said Alexander never truly lost consciousness. He could see, hear, and think, but he couldn't speak. That detail fascinated generations. A silent conqueror, trapped in a motionless body, surrounded by anxious generals. It made sense that people suspected foul play, because silence in a royal court usually means secrets. The poison theory, by the way, didn't come from modern thrillers. It was born within days of his death. One especially juicy story blamed a poison so cold and subtle that it could take days to kill, brewed supposedly from the icy waters of a river in the far north. In another version, the poison came in a mule's hoof because, apparently, every assassin in ancient history had to have some creative storage method. Then there was Aristotle's name again, floating around suspiciously. Supposedly, he'd suggested the rare toxin idea to Antipater, because what's a philosophical legacy without a bit of scandal? Realistically, none of this makes much sense. Poisons in that era were quick and messy, nothing elegant enough to mimic typhoid for 2 weeks. But rumor beats reason 9 times out of 10, especially when people are scared of losing their favorite hero. Even centuries later, Roman writers retold the story with extra flourishissimo drama, more treachery, more moral lessons about hubris. That's the nice thing about dead kings. They make great teaching material. But while the ancients obsessed over motive, modern scholars fixated on symptoms. Ever since the Theache, century doctors started treating ancient history like a post-mortem detective game. They've diagnosed Alexander with almost every disease imaginable. The old favorite was malaria. That one works on a practical level. It fits Babylon's climate and could explain the fever, delirium, and exhaustion. Then came typhoid fever, another strong candidate, especially when combined with the stress of constant campaigning. Typhoid can also cause intestinal perforation. So, it's not exactly a good way to go. In the 20th century, a more exotic guess entered the chat. Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune attack on the nervous system that can paralyze you while leaving your consciousness intact. That one appealed to everyone who liked the he was alive while they buried him angle. The idea goes that Alexander might have slipped into near paralysis, mistaken for death. His breathing would have slowed, his pulse impossible to detect without modern tools. And voila, suddenly, we have a prematurely embalmed god-king. Creepy. Absolutely plausible, possibly, and darkly poetic enough to satisfy pretty much everyone. Then there's the more human interpretation. It wasn't gods, or poisons, or mysteries at all. Maybe Alexander simply broke down. The man had spent over a decade living like a whirlwind, marching through extreme climates, drinking heavily, killing people who annoyed him, surviving a lung wound that probably left permanent scarring. Modern medicine would call that chronic trauma. A was 32, physically battered, emotionally volatile, and living in a city full of mixed loyalties. A bacterial infection under those conditions, practically guaranteed, but of course no one wanted the story to end there. To the Greek world, Alexander was more than a man. He was a symbol of limitless ambition, so they converted his messy, mortal death into a myth that could keep inspiring half-god, half-cautionary tale. Eventually, this myth ballooned into something funnier and stranger. In later centuries, writers claimed Alexander didn't actually die at all. He merely vanished. Some said his soul was taken up into the heavens. Others sighed AD marched into the eastern deserts and simply never returned. A few apocalyptic traditions even turned him into a cosmic gatekeeper, yes. Really, medieval Persian and Islamic folklore called him Iskandar Vul Karnan, meaning the two-horned one, a hero who built a wall to keep out the forces of darkness. It's a strange second act for a Macedonian general, but history loves repurposing its stars. When empires fade, myths are cheap currency. And yet, under all the noise, something oddly gentle survives. For all his self-promotion and arrogance, Alexander's death story isn't angry or explosive. It's quiet. No battlefields, no thunder, just a room in Babylon growing hotter by the hour, a bed, and a man trying to speak, but failing. That image lingered because it felt almost too human. It reminded everyone then and now that even the grandest mortals, and the same, not with armies, but with breath, slowly fading against the heat. Let's drift forward again. Centuries later, Alexandria is a Roman city now. Its wide marble streets echo with merchants instead of philosophers. Somewhere near the royal quarter, a grand glass tomb glints faintly in the sun. That was still Alexander. People queued to see him. Rulers made pilgrimages. A Roman emperor might bring a garland and leave muttering about destiny. Another might sneak a touch at the mummified cheek just to see what divinity felt like. According to one legend, Caligula actually stole the golden armor from the corpse and replaced it with his own because subtlety was not his strong suit. Then, slowly, the visits stopped. Earthquakes came. Floods. City plans shifted. The Ptolemaic dynasty fell. Egypt changed hands. And by the 4th century AD, no one could remember exactly where the tomb was. Archaeologists have been chasing it ever since, serious scholars with notebooks and less serious treasure hunters with shovels. Each generation swears they're probably standing right above it. None of them ever are. Maybe that's the final trick. The one last disappearance. The conqueror who refused to stay put even in death. And maybe that's the odd beauty of Alexander's story. Tried to conquer the world, and instead he conquered imagination. Every culture he touched reshaped him. Greeks saw him as a divine hero. Persians reinterpreted him as a chosen king. Indians included him in philosophical tales, and medieval writers turned him into a symbol of human ambition. By the time Renaissance scholars rediscovered his name, no single version of Alexander could claim to be the real one. He wasn't Macedonian anymore. He was mythic property. He had become what he always wanted. Everywhere. But if you pull away from the legend and just picture the man, there's something quietly sad about it all. A lonely prodigy raised on myths of gods and glory, pushed by a domineering mother and an assassinated father, taught by philosophers, thrust into leadership too soon, and doomed to chase perfection he could never reach. Maybe his death wasn't mysterious. Maybe it was simply overdue. His body shut down because the mind refused to rest. That's not uncommon in any century. Let's pause there again. Just above the slow-moving river Euphrates, the night humming with insects, Babylon sleeps, unaware that its most famous guest is fading away inside the palace. Soldiers watch their torches burn low. Servants whisper to each other about omens and stars. Somewhere a flute plays through the corridor, soft and unsure. And Alexander lies there, trying to move his hand, maybe to give one last order, maybe just to feel something steady before the dark. That's probably what happened. No poison at the bottom of a cup, no sinister conspiracies under the moonlight, just fatigue, fever, the slow, quiet undoing of a body that carried too much history in too short a time. Maybe that's the real mystery, that a man who lived entirely in motion finally had to stop. Thousands of years later, he still refuses to stop haunting people. Writers, teachers, rulers all keep coming back to him, because he's the perfect contradiction. Brilliant and reckless visionary, and self-destructive, godlike and heartbreakingly mortal. Every time you picture him, he changes, sometimes a philosopher, sometimes a tyrant, sometimes a shimmering blur of heroism under the desert sun. And maybe that's the point, not who he was, but what he became. An echo that never really goes silent. So tonight, as we close this story, imagine that echo. The slow, steady rhythm of sandals on hot sand. The murmur of an army moving toward some distant horizon. The smell of smoke and dust. And behind it all, one voice, confident, restless, unreachable. And then nothing. Just the sound of wind. Because even great empires need their silence. And history, in the end, always chooses quietness over noise. That's where we'll leave Alexander, half legend, half ghost, lingering somewhere between Babylon's lost walls and Alexandria's buried streets. No tomb, just memory. Sleep well, conqueror. Now we're going on one of those slow, dreamy journeys across time, the kind that probably pairs well with a cup of something warm and the faint hum of rain outside your window. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the chaos of the day slip away, because tonight we're exploring entire worlds that just ... disappeared. Civilizations that built cities, carved gods, invented languages, and then quietly vanished, like someone erased them from history's save file. No grand finales here, no alien invasions, no exploding volcano montages. Just this low, eerie silence that comes after people leave, when the wind moves through empty streets, and no one remembers the names that used to echo there. It's peaceful in a way, a little haunting, and exactly our kind of bedtime story. So, let us drift back through those dusty corridors of time and pay a quiet visit to a few civilizations that disappeared so completely, they might as well have packed up reality itself. Let's start in the turquoise deserts of Pakistan. Somewhere around 2600 BC, here we meet the Indus Valley civilization, one of those ancient overachievers that history almost forgot, possibly because they were too peaceful and organized for chroniclers to find interesting. At its peak, it spanned an area bigger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Dozens of cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, neatly built in grids, each with drainage systems so advanced that your modern apartment's plumbing might feel insecure. No crazy pharaohs, no conquering generals, no dramatic god-kings, insisting you write hymns about their cheekbones. Just planners, builders, traders, and presumably people who liked things clean. Their cities even had public baths and sewage lines connected to every house. This was 4,000 years ago. Mind you, while Europe was still casually discovering what agriculture was. Everything about them screams competent adulthood, which may be why their disappearance feels so odd. Around 1900 BCE, the pattern of their neat lives started to crumble. Wells dried. Trade dwindled. Cities emptied. And then ... silence. When British archaeologists rediscovered the ruins thousands of years later, they were stunned. No monuments. No royal palaces, no tombs stuffed with gold, just tidy streets covered in sand and mystery. Their script still not because linguists aren't trying, but because they left us zero long texts. Just little seals with symbols, likely used for trade, helpful for invoices, not for translating an entire language. So, we still have no idea what they called themselves, what gods they worshipped, or what they talked about while soaking in those impressive public baths. The usual suspects for their downfall are climate change, river shifts, or over-farming, the kind of things that feel distressingly familiar. Some scholars suggest they moved east and merged with cultures that became early Indian societies. Others like to whisper about invasion, naturally, because whenever something disappears, we humans conjure barbarians. But the Indus story feels quieter than that. No burned layers, no bones piled up. Just cities neatly folded back into dust, like they simply decided civilization was overrated and walked into the sunset. Now let's drift to the Mediterranean. Not Greece, not Rome. Those two are loud enough already, but the mysterious Minoans of Crete. They were the kind of people who seemed allergic to boredom. Frescoes of dolphins in soft blues and pinks, women with flounced skirts, that looked suspiciously modern. Palaces that had indoor plumbing when most of Europe still thought the future meant another field of goats. The Minoans were sea traders, art lovers, and apparently fans of giant bulls, which is brave and possibly foolish, depending on how you define entertainment. They built labyrinthine palaces, the most famous being Knossos, a place so dazzling that when Sir Arthur Evans dug it up in the 1900s, he got carried away and decided to repaint half of it himself. Archaeologists still sigh about that one. The thing about the Minoans is they give off this serene, organized vibe. Frescoes show people leaping gracefully over bulls, not stabbing neighbors. And yet, right when they seem to have everything figured out, something shifted. Sometime around 1450 BCE, their cities went quiet. Entire palaces burned. Writing systems changed. For centuries. People blamed the volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Therawats, now Santorini, and yes, that was one of the biggest explosions in recorded history. The sky darkened. The seas shook. But the details blur. Some places show signs of natural disasters, others of invasion, possibly by those mainland neighbors we later call Mycenaeans, the ancient Greeks before they had better PR. So, the Minoans disappeared, leaving behind frescoes, myths, and a legendary labyrinth that probably inspired the story of the Minotaur, half-man, half-bull creature trapped underground. Which feels fitting, really. A civilization so obsessed with bulls and beauty ends up remembered through a monster story, because of course it does. Now, let's float even further south, drifting through swaying reeds of the Nile Delta. Before the pharaohs built their glorious pyramids, there was another mystery tucked along North Africa's deserts. The Nabta Playa culture. This one existed somewhere around 5000 BC, before Stonehenge, before writing, before almost anything we'd call civilization. Nomads, herdsmen, astronomers, take your pick. These people didn't build cities. They built patterns. Out in the sand, they arranged stones in circles, aligned with the summer solstice. Astronomical markers that suggest they tracked the stars long before Egypt's pyramids or Mesopotamian temples existed. Then, around 3000 BC, gone. No collapse, just absence. Maybe their water sources dried up, forcing them toward the Nile, where they merged into early Egyptian society. In that case, they didn't vanish, they simply changed addresses. Still, the thought that a group of prehistoric herders designed a cosmic calendar in the middle of nowhere and then walked away from it forever is quietly stunning. The funny thing about vanished civilizations is how polite they are about leaving traces. They don't leave grand farewell notes. No "be right back" carved into temple walls. Just enough ruins to spark archaeologists' imaginations and ruin their weekends. Sometimes, what's gone tells us more about survival than disaster. Take the Nubian kingdoms, just south of Egypt. People tend to forget there were entire empires thriving there: Tukurma, Napata, Maruich, deeply interconnected, with their own pyramids, their own gods, and rulers powerful enough to make pharaohs nervous. For centuries, they rivaled Egypt, even ruling it at one point, yet slowly they faded, absorbed by trade shifts and migrations. By 400 AD, their last major city fell quiet, swallowed by desert sand. Still, the ruins shimmer there, today's mall pyramids lined in gold sunlight, humble but stubborn. A soft reminder that history isn't a straight line. It's more like a tide, rolling forward, retreating, leaving behind patterns no one completely understands. Now, before you drift off entirely, imagine this pattern stretching across the planet, because every continent holds a few of these ghosts. Intended cities like Kerala appeared and disappeared before the Incas decided mountains were fashionable. In eastern Anatolia, the Hurrians built cities that later merged into cultures we vaguely remember from the Bible. Across North America, the ancestral Pueblones carved homes into cliffs, lived there for centuries, and then simply left them empty. And every time we stumble across their traces, the same thought comes. How could people so advanced just vanish? But that's the trick, isn't it? Maybe vanish is the wrong word. Maybe they changed faster than the Earth could record. Climate, trade, disease, migration-slow forces that erase quietly the way waves smooth footprints from sand. Let's stay with that image for a moment. An ancient city at dusk. Empty streets lined with broken walls, once painted bright with life. The air full of silence that used to be music. The last inhabitants turning their backs and stepping into the dusk, unaware that the world will forget their names for 4,000 years. Everything you can picture from that to soft wind, the echo of footsteps, the slight shimmer of heat on stone, that's all the evidence history gives us. And somehow, that feels enough. Because, what's more mysterious, a civilization destroyed by catastrophe, or one that simply fades without complaint. So tonight, as the first part of our journey winds down, we've wandered through ruins with no stories, languages no one can read, gods no one remembers, and all of them whisper the same quiet truth. Nothing really lasts. Not power, not fame, not endless plumbing systems. But maybe that's a comfort. Civilizations come and go, yet life goes on. Humans keep building, losing, dreaming again. Somewhere a small fire still burns in the desert night, the same way it did 5,000 years ago. And maybe that's what connects us, the quiet persistence of starting over. Let's drift with that thought for now. Because in the next part, we'll wander even deeper into the jungle's glaciers and oceans where other lost worlds once thrived before silently bowing out. For now, breathe. Let the ruins fade back into sand. Welcome, Bike. The night's a little quieter now. The candle's lower, and we're heading somewhere softer into the green hush of jungles and forgotten valleys. Because if deserts were history's dusty libraries, jungles are its locked rooms. They hide entire chapters until someone with a machete and too much caffeine decides to take a look. And when they do, the ground opens to reveal whole civilizations we managed to lose for centuries. Let's start with a favorite, the Maya. The Maya appeared around 2000 BCE, in the humid, sun-soaked lands of modern-day Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico. They farmed maize, built cities among the trees, and developed a writing system so intricate that early scholars assumed aliens had to be involved, because apparently humans being smart was still hard to accept. Their cities Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque were masterpieces of stone and geometry. Towering pyramids rose from dense forests like teeth pushing through green skin. They charted planets, predicted eclipses, and invented a calendar so mathematically precise that modern conspiracy theorists still refuse to leave it alone. Life revolved around kings, rituals, astronomy, and an impressive amount of architectural effort devoted to pleasing gods who seemed permanently unimpressed. And then, one day, they were gone. Okay, not gone. The Maya people still exist. Their descendants still speak Mayan language, but their glorious city-states empty. Between 750 and 900 CE, the classic Maya civilization collapsed. Temples stopped being built. Hieroglyphic texts abruptly ended. Populations plummeted. Jungles swallowed their cities whole. You could wander near one back then and think you were just hearing frogs and birds, not realizing there was a metropolis under the vines. So what happened? The most polite answer to many problems arriving at once. Centuries of farming had exhausted the land. Drought hit at exactly the wrong time. City after city needed resources that simply weren't there anymore. Add in a few wars, a dash of political overdrama, and you have history's equivalent of a burnout. The Maya didn't explode, they quietly unraveled. People drifted away from the monumental centers and rebuilt lives on smaller scales. And yet, the ruins remain, staring through tree roots like memories that refused to fade. The gods didn't vanish. The ceremonies didn't vanish. They just went underground, waiting for quieter times. Speaking of quieter times, let's move even further back, long before the Maya rose to the They lived along the Gulf Coast of Mexico around 1200 BCE, and if you've ever seen those massive stone heads with serene faces and mystery carved into every line that asks them, we don't know what they called themselves, only that modern Nahuatl speakers later named them meaning rubber people. Since the area produced the sap used to make early rubber. Catchy nickname? slightly unhelpful for cultural identification. They were the first true civilization of Mesoamerica, builders of ceremonial centers, inventors of writing systems we still can't fully read, and probably the originators of the famous Mesoamerican ball game, a sport that looked casual, right until you realized losers might lose their heads. Then, around 400 BCE, their ceremonial centers were abandoned. No clear reason. Some think volcanic eruptions covered farmland with ash. Others talk about rivers changing course. Maybe disease, maybe floods. Maybe they were absorbed by rising cultures like the Zapotecs or early Maya. Whatever the cause, the Olmecs disappeared quietly, the first echo of a pattern that would haunt nearly every Mesoamerican civilization after them. They even left their colossal stone heads turned toward the jungle, faces half buried but calm, as if they saw all this coming. Now, swing north, not too fast. We're staying sleepy, and picture cliffs glowing red under sunset light. We're in the American Southwest, in the Four Corners region, where the ancestral Pueblones built one of the world's strangest and most haunting communities. Canyons as cathedrals, silence as music. Around 700 CE, they carved entire towns into cliffs, the most famous being Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. They made roads that lined up with solstice shadows, storage rooms that preserved corn for years, and kivas-round ceremonial chambers dug deep into the ground, connecting people both literally and spiritually to the earth. Life revolved around corn, sun, and cooperation. Then something shifted. By 1300 CE, most of the great cliff cities were empty. Again, no apocalypse, just a slow, painful leaving. Drought and invasions from neighboring peoples likely played a role. When food disappears, faith tends to follow. Communities fragmented, moving south and east, some merging with the ancestors of the modern Hopi and Zuni, and for 700 years, those hollow cliffs stared out over empty valleys, catching dust and legends. Later, wanderers found them and assumed an unknown race had built them, because of course they did. History always forgets to ask the locals. Now that we've wandered through jungles and canyons, let's glide toward Islandsby, because some of the strangest vanishings happen far out at sea. You've probably heard of one: Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, tiny, remote. Famous for the Moithos giant stone faces that look like they're waiting for someone to apologize. For centuries, the Rapa Nui people carved hundreds of these colossal heads from volcanic rock, dragged them across the island with impossible ingenuity, and set them facing inland toward their villages. It was part devotion, part ancestral pride. And then, by the time Europeans arrived in the 18th century, everything had collapsed: deforestation, population decline, war, slavery. The Moai toppled, villages burned. For a while, historians told a moralistic tale, that they destroyed themselves through greed and resource misuse, a neat little ecological fable. But modern research shows something less preachy and more tragic. The Rapa Nui adapted well for centuries, until outside contact, smallpox, and slave raids shredded what was left. So, another civilization didn't simply vanish, it was swallowed by global history creeping in from the horizon. Even now, the surviving Rapa Nui speak of those statues as living relatives, watching over the island. History turned them to ruins. Faith kept them as family. We could stop there. But let's drift one more time westward, deep into the Pacific Ocean to Non-Madel, a city that feels like a fever dream. It lies off the coast of Pohnpei Island in Micronesia, a labyrinth of artificial islets built from massive basalt logs stacked like dominoes on coral reefs. Sometimes it's called the Venice of the Pacific. Mostly, it just feels impossible. No one's entirely sure who built it or why. Oral legends say it was the work of twin sorcerers who floated the stones across the water using spells. Less magical explanations suggest local dynasties built it around 1000 CE. As a ceremonial center, then it was abandoned. Probably for the same reasons as everywhere else: disease, shifting power, but it still stands, partly underwater, black stones shining through blue tides. It's strange to think of generations spending lifetimes stacking those basalt pillars. only for them to sink into the lagoon's cool silence. From the air, Nan Madol looks like a chessboard designed by ghosts. You'll notice a rhythm by now. Every disappearance sounds different, but feels the same. Growth, brilliance, fatigue, silence. The Maya built too grand to sustain. The Almecs carved too large to carry on. The ancestral Puebloans faced drought. The Rapa Nui faced isolation. All of them danced between creation and collapse, the way all living things do. It's oddly comforting. Even the greatest societies are temporary. Their best work is destined to crumble gracefully back into earth and sea. Of course, humans are terrible at accepting impermanence. We keep trying to solve it. That's how lost civilizations get tangled with myths. Atlantis, El Dorado, Lemuria, Muevri. Culture invents its own vanished world to explain the mystery of ruin, because it's nicer to imagine that greatness sank heroically into the sea than to admit that time and drought are the real destroyers. Plato invented Atlantis as a moral parable. His version of Dante let success make you lazy. Centuries later, people started treating it like a travel brochure. Expeditions, sonar, conspiracy books, you name it. But perhaps Atlantis isn't a place. Maybe it's just our reflection, humanity, looking in the mirror of history, seeing all the civilizations we've already lost, and calling it one big myth to make it hurt less. If you're still awakened, if not, that's fine. Just picture the world from above. Continents glowing faintly under moonlight, rivers tracing veins of silver across them. Somewhere under that surface lie cities we haven't found yet. Whole lifetimes, buried under forests, drowned under silt, hidden under shopping malls, 1,000 Indus valleys, and when we dig them up, all we find are small objects. A cup, a bead, a broken tablet, a stone head with a faint smile. Little reminders that greatness leaves soft footprints, and maybe it's supposed to. If human history were drawn as a heartbeat, it would look like those curves in the sand after the tide, the rise, the stillness, the fade. Civilizations don't really vanish. They transform, dissolve, reappear in new shapes. You, sitting here now with your phone or laptop, are part of some future archaeologist's ruin. Your world, with all its networks and noise, will someday be an unreadable relic, bits of plastic and glass buried under earth, waiting for someone to wonder who we were. And that's strangely peaceful to consider, because at least it means we re-part of the same story, the same endless rhythm of building and letting go. Let's stop here for the night, with the jungle quiet again, the waves over Nan Madol lapping softly, and the stars blinking down like tiny ancient lanterns. Tomorrow or next, Vita will sink even deeper into time, back before writing, before wheels, when entire peoples walked off the stage of history, leaving only stones facing the sky. For now, just breathe. The world is still turning, the ruins are still dreaming, and the silence they left behind is older than any of us. Sleep well among the vanished. All right, you're still here. Welcome back to the soft eddies of vanished history. Let's drift even deeper into the shadows where the lines between myth and memory start to blur, and places once teeming with life now only whisper through weathered stones. And you might want to keep the blanket close. These stories are quieter than ever, but somehow heavier, full of slow endings instead of sudden collapses. Let us begin with what many historians call the Bronze Age collapse, a phrase that sounds abrupt but was more of a prolonged sigh from the ancient world. It was around 1200 BCE that the interconnected kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean began unraveling in a way that still puzzles scholars. Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, and the Levant, once thriving centers of bronze, trade, and burgeoning empires, started to fall apart. Scythia's burned trade routes dried up. Written records halted. Royal palaces were left empty. We don't have a smoking gun or a single culprit. Instead, it's as if everything conspired quietly against them. Some blame waves of mysterious sea peoples, groups sailing in from nowhere, causing chaos and destruction. Others point to natural disasters, earthquakes, droughts, perhaps even climate shifts that made farming impossible for years. Still others suggest economic collapse and internal strife. the jeweled recipe for kingdoms falling apart while sending each other angry letters. The scale was staggering entire civilizations, sputtering and shutting down within a few decades. But it wasn't a sudden apocalypse or fiery end. It was a slow, shuddering collapse, like a house built on sand that finally cracks under the weight of its own ambition. For centuries afterward, many regions remained quiet. Cities abandoned and forgotten beneath layers of forest and dirt. New cultures slowly emerged in the ashes, eventually setting the stage for the classical civilizations we know better. But those lost centuries, they feel like a blink in the long gaze of time, a quiet mystery of forgotten kings and ruined thrones. While the Bronze Age collapse suffocated ancient empires, across the ocean, the Pacific whispered its own We already touched on Nan Madalbutt. The Pacific is dotted with small islands, where once thriving societies crafted oceanic kingdoms impressive in their isolation. Take the kingdom of Sodalor on Pohnpei Island. For example, it rose around 1100 CE, ruling through centralized power with fantastic stone architecture, walls wide and tall enough to wow even today's builders. But after several centuries, the kingdom fractured, replaced by more local, clan-based systems once again, the story of central power dissolving into many small voices. Small islands, limited resources, and changing weather patterns may have played a part, reminding us that even the mightiest oceanic kings are at the mercy of nature's rhythm. Moving westward, though the ocean may seem endless, the ancient world fades into quieter shadows in Asia and Africa. Take the Gondwana kingdoms hidden in the forests of southern India, or the kingdom of Aksum. In northeast Africa, flourishing for centuries, supporting trade routes stretching from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, these kingdoms declined more subtly through shifting trade networks, changing geopolitical tides, and the steady creep of new powers. Their ruins, sometimes just large stones, half swallowed by vines, or odd shapes in ruined temples hidden beneath soil centuries thick. They remind us that history isn't just grand battles and famous rulers, it's also a patient return to earth of stone and bone. And then there are the civilizations that accomplish something else entirely, blending into the present without drama, moving through history as a gradual whisper. The peoples of the Amazon rainforest have been there for millennia, shaping the land with agriculture, earthworks, and settlements that researchers are only now slowly beginning to understand. Their cities often went unnoticed by explorers, hidden beneath canopies and soil. Some vanished centuries ago, not with fire and war, but receding quietly as forest reclaimed the stones. Their legacy lives not in grand monuments, but in the soil, in stories passed along, and in the resilient cultures that persist quietly today. If we draw the map of vanished civilizations on a broad canvas, what emerges isn't just a trail of ruins, but an oddly coherent rhythm. Civilizations rise, mingle, and fall, not necessarily with violence or cataclysm, but often with quiet exhaustion. The forces of nature, human limitation, and time itself play lead roles. No empire, no matter how cunning or bold, wins forever. Even the greatest cities, Babylon, Rome, Tenochtitlan, Angkor, eventually grew still. They didn't disappear because someone waved a magic wand or because aliens came for a souvenir. They disappeared because life is change, and change always calls for new beginnings. And that brings us to the ultimate paradox. We dig up these civilizations, ask questions filled with wonder and sorrow, desperate for answers about why they vanished. But maybe the real story isn't why. Maybe it's how. How they vanish without fanfare. How they leave behind enough to remind us. How even in fading away, they teach us about endurance. The Indus cities still boast drainage in their dust. The Minoan frescoes pulse with color despite millennia. The Maya pyramids still honor the sun. The Moai gaze silently over an island of memory. Even a vanished civilization leaves a pulse, a heartbeat beneath the surface that outlasts the stone. And maybe that's the quiet miracle. They vanish without silence. They vanish into stories. They vanish into us. When you look at a ruined wall, a broken pot, a carved head staring blankly across centuries, you're looking at the breath of unknown peoples, still whispering through time's endless corridors. So the next time you feel small or fleeting, remind yourself, every stone was once a story, every ruin a home, every dust grain a memory, and life, even when it vanishes, never leaves empty hands. Let's close now for real this time on a gentle note towards sleep. Imagine the quiet hum of stars far above some forgotten city, the soft stir of night winds through empty streets, the slow, steady rhythm of moonlight touching ancient stones. The world turns, as it always has. Cities rise, fall, melt into soil, and new stories grow from old roots. And somewhere, deep under the earth, lost civilizations wait patiently for us to remember them, not in thunder or fanfare, but in whispers, slow and sure. Sleep well among those whispers, because tonight, their stories are our lullabies. That's where we'll leave. Ancient civilizations that vanished without a trace. Quiet worlds fading softly into time's embrace. Good night.